are in a series on Galatians, or staying in Galatians, and I want to jump in, and Andy did an excellent job a couple weeks ago moving us through Galatians 1, and so I'm going to tie up the end of Galatians 1. And just remembering, this is Paul who's writing this to the churches in Galatia. And these are churches that he helped found and taught in and traveled and ministered in. And so as an apostle to the Gentiles. And so the Gentiles were those that were not Jewish by birth. And so they were seen as what they would call uncircumcised. They worshiped idols. They had different culture than the Jewish people. They had a different religion. And so they were seen as less than in many cases, but absolutely seen as different than. And Paul had a calling on his life to minister and take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. And even though he was born a Roman citizen, he was also born a Jew. He was zealous in his study of Judaism. He came up through the ranks as a young man and known for his mind and his ability to understand the Old Testament scriptures and to teach them. And so he was recognized as someone who was at the top of his class in Judaism. And because of that, he was commissioned early on after Jesus' death. Paul was commissioned to go around and persecute this sect of Judaism called the Christians, or the followers of the way, or the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus. And so his task was to go and arrest them, or to have them beaten, and in some cases to have them killed, to try to stop this movement that was declaring that Jesus was the Messiah and that he had established a new covenant, which was doing away with the old covenant. All of the things that Paul had spent his life learning and believing in were being undone by these new followers of Jesus. And so he went and he persecuted them. And then, as we know from his story and then from Acts, that Jesus intercepted him and awakened his heart to the reality of who Jesus was. And then Paul began to have a revelation of Jesus based on all of the things he had learned, but also the Spirit of God showing him and teaching him the gospel. And so Paul's trying to establish that he is an apostle to the Gentiles. But what's happening is that there are people who are coming from the Christians in Jerusalem who are coming to these Gentiles that Paul is converting, and they're telling them that you have to follow the religion of Judaism. You have to be circumcised. You have to follow the law. You have to essentially become Jewish to be able to receive the Jewish Messiah. And so they were trying to give them rules and stipulations that said you have to follow the law. And so Paul is saying, my authority is not coming from the Jerusalem church. My authority comes from this conversion moment between me and Jesus and my journey with Jesus to have this revelation of the gospel that I am teaching to you. And I am not saying I come from Jerusalem. I am saying my gospel comes directly from Jesus. And so this is what Paul is trying to establish as he writes to the Galatian churches. And so he's telling them this story. He says in verse 18, Galatians 1, after 3 years, I spread the gospel. He spread the gospel in Damascus and the surrounding countryside. I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, which is Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Verse 20, I assure you before God that what I'm writing to you is no lie. Why does that matter? Because, like I said, Paul's trying to establish that his authority is not coming from Peter or James or the Jerusalem Christians. Throughout Paul's ministry, you see, as you read different letters that he wrote, you will see that he was constantly questioned. His apostleship was constantly brought into contention by those who would try to come in and teach legalism into his churches and to the people that he was discipling. So he was there to defend the simplicity of the gospel. In verse 21, and then eventually I went to Syria and Cilicia, which would have been Tarsus, where he was born, and Antioch, which is where some of this story takes place. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report. The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith that he once tried to destroy. I love this powerful testimony In verse 24, and they praised God because of me. So let there be, if nothing else this morning, let there just be a simple encouragement in this, is that Paul was as far from Jesus as you could possibly imagine, and Jesus intercepted him and changed his entire life to the point that now he's coming back to these folks that he previously was persecuting. They know the stories of what he had done to them. And so in fear and trepidation, they slowly began to receive him in. But when they saw and heard the gospel, his story, his testimony, and the gospel that he was proclaiming, they praised Jesus because of him. And so I want us to be encouraged in that this morning, because I know that if we think about this in terms of Paul and his story and what God did in that divine encounter was so amazing. But I also know that each one of us carry people in our hearts that we are longing to have, for God to have a divine encounter with them and to change their hearts and to change their minds. And I simply want us to look at Paul's life as an encouragement that God is pursuing every single human on this planet, that he is after those that you are concerned for and praying for, that he is after them even more than you are, if you can imagine it. He loves them more than you do, and he has the opportunity and the means to be able to intercept their life in a way that would be miraculous, that they would come back and tell you a story of how Jesus intercepted their life. I want that to be on our minds and our hearts as we walk out of this place today. If you hear nothing else, is that God is pursuing those that I'm praying for, that I am loving on, that I am waiting on. Take some pressure off of yourself. Not to go like, oh, it doesn't matter, because your prayers do matter. But also take some pressure off of yourself, maybe in every single interaction that you have with someone, that you don't have to be the sole reason that they turn to Jesus because you said just the right thing in just the right moment, and you're holding every encounter with so much stress and maybe even fear that it doesn't allow you to simply exude grace and love in those interactions. You don't have to rescue that person. Jesus is after them. And he may want to use you more powerfully if you're not operating in fear and worry and hand-wringing, and you're able to give them over to the Lord and then walk with the Lord in pursuit of that person that may not look like you, as I said, having to say the exact right thing every time that you interact with them. Just have some grace for yourself and have some grace for them, and let the love of Jesus exude through your life and watch what happens. Just be encouraged in that.